Hi, guys. Um, so today we're going to have a brief lecture about just war theory. We'll look at terrorism and civil disobedience. Also, a couple of housekeeping things. Most of you have signed up for your presentations. The few of you who haven't, there are still some slots for tomorrow, which is the 29th. If all of those are filled and we still need some, I will put out another date for you to sign up for that. Secondly, your final papers are due to me today, the 28th. If you need more time, you need to get in touch with me. When I set the date originally, I was supposed to be headed to Europe in a couple of weeks. That's not happening now, so I can allow for a little bit more time, but I need to get them graded and get them back in, and I have 20-something, almost 30 of you, and 40 in another class, so that's a lot of papers for me to read over the next 2 weeks, so please do get those into me. Finally, your final exam, which is going to still be a terminology exam. It will be on Canvas, so it'll be a quiz on Canvas. The way I'm going to do that is I'm going to send you a list of 20 terms. 15 of those will definitely be on the exam. I will choose another 15 that you do not know. At first, I was just going to have you select, but given this whole scenario we're in now, I just thought about it. It's easier for me just to give you 15 terms that definitely will be on the exam. And then I will find 15 more. Your exam will be worth 15 points, so that's half a point each out of the 30 questions. Okay? Any questions about any of that, email me. So final papers due today. Class presentations, you should be signed up for tomorrow. If there are still people who haven't signed up, I'll open up another slot for the next week in May. And your final exam, I will send you 20 terms. Of those 20 terms, 15 will definitely be on the exam. And the other 15, when it comes to exam time, you won't know ahead of time. But I don't see how I'm going to prevent you from using resources to do this, because you'll be doing it at home and everything like that. So everybody should do really well in the final exam. Okay, so let's get started and talk about just war, terrorism, and civil disobedience. So we begin with let's think of it in context. For most of your life, just most of you, the United States has been engaged in war in Afghanistan. It probably began when you were just very young children. In fact, it's a sad reality that there are people whose fathers served, and then they've grown up and they're now serving in Afghanistan in that war. Then we also had Iraq that the United States went into after Afghanistan. So we were fighting war on two fronts. And then, of course, if we look back through history, we can talk about Vietnam, the Korean War. It's just sometimes called the Forgotten War, or sometimes even the Korean conflict, as though not to call it an actual war. And of course, World War II. Many of your grandparents or great-grandparents might have served in that. My grandfather was in World War II. He served in the Pacific. Never really talked about it. My other grandfather was exempted because he was a farmer, and so farmers were thought to be important, continuing to work their farms. So, when we think about it, there's been a lot of war. The United States was really born within the context of war. But have you ever thought, what are the rules, what are the requirements for us if we should choose to go into war? How do we make that decision? Is it just like we see sometimes There is someone blows up one of our ships or shoots a missile at us, and then we're just going to war. In truth, there is a whole ethical construct around when a nation should go to war. And it's called just war theory. Not just war. It's what is the justification for going to war. And it was, the first part of it was largely developed by St. Thomas Aquinas. If you have taken my Intro to Philosophy class, you would know that we talked about Aquinas. There are other classes where you might have heard about Aquinas. He's most known for his proofs for the existence of God. But in this, he was trying to find justification. Remember that there was a time when the Western churches were going east to wage crusades throughout the Middle East. And so he was trying to come up with justification for war. Is it possible for Christians to engage in war? And so he came up with some points. And so we're going to talk about those. And so we're asking the question, when is it or is it ever justified to use violence against another country? We might even ask if it's ever justified to use violence against another individual. But let's just stick with just war theory at this point. And then I'll tell you a story in just a few moments. So just war theory is there are 6 points that we want to consider for this. So the first one, according to Aquinas, was that the cause for war must be just. So the cause for going to war must be somehow justified. An insult to our leader probably is not a reason to go to war. But in World War II, for example, we thought we were eminently justified defending our allies and also defending or trying to liberate those who have been taken as prisoners in the what eventually came to be known as the Holocaust. And so, is the war justified? Now, that raises some questions when we come to something like invading Afghanistan and staying there for, it's going on 20 years now that we've been there. Is that still justified? Even if you think it was justified at one point, you have to ask the question: at what point did we renew our justification, or were we responsible? Famously, back before George W. Bush wanted to invade Iraq, Colin Powell, who was the I forget if he was the Secretary of State at the time or he was some still like chairman of the Joint Chiefs or something like that. He explained to the president before we were going into Iraq, he says, look, they're pretty stable right now. This is a matter of record. You can look this up. He said, they're stable right now. And he said to the president, if we break it, we own it. And of course, the United States stayed in Iraq for a long period of time, even after we supposedly had won the peace, because we had to restabilize the country. So the first point is that war must be just. So the cause of the war, the cause of the fight must be just. Secondly, the war must be sanctioned by the proper authority. And so here is where we get into a distinction of non-state actors, which I'll talk about. I want to give you some definitions in a few moments. So non-state actors. So if we're talking about war, however, it has to be sanctioned by the proper authority. And that is generally understood as nations that are recognized by other nations. so that if they would be recognized enough to hold a seat, say, for example, in the UN, then we might say that those would be the proper authorities to sanction a war one against another. So there must be a proper authority to sanction, to say this is okay to do this. The third point put forth by Thomas Aquinas was that the war should be fought with the right intentions. So your intentions must be right. By that, we're thinking there that to say we're going to war and we're going to take all the oil from a country would not be to have the right intentions. But if we say we're going to liberate people from oppression, from some tyrannical dictator who is killing people indiscriminately, then our intentions then would be right. So that raises the question then, why haven't we acted in Syria, for example? But some would argue and say America as a nation itself has not been attacked. So we would not be sanctioned in any way. We would not be justified in any way. Our intentions, whereas they might be good, weighed against other things, would not be just, for us to engage in war in Syria. But that hasn't stopped us to intervene in other situations throughout our history. And there are a number of those in particular that we could call to mind. Most prominently in my lifetime has been our intervention in Kosovo, and there are others as well. So there must be the right intentions. So the war should be fought with the right intentions. Now, just war theory, as Aquinas articulated, it pretty much ended with those three. But it was later expanded as people began to think about this and to try to articulate what would be the justification for war. And so our fourth, fifth, and sixth points were added. And the fourth one is that armed conflict should be the last resort. So have we exhausted diplomacy completely? Have we done everything that we possibly could to resolve the conflict without actually going to war? Have we negotiated? Have we invited allies of the one in which we would go to war against to be involved? In other words, as a mediator, for example. So have we exhausted every other possibility to prevent the war, and so therefore the armed conflict must be the last resort. Number 5, the good resulting from the war must be proportional to the bad resulting from the war. And so if we, for example, were to have a nuclear war, do you think that the good resulting from that would outweigh the bad? So the bad from that, most of you didn't grow up under this, but I mean, I grew up in a time where we actually had civil defense drills where we would have to hide under our desk or something like that, as if some puny little desk was going to protect us from a nuclear blast. But we did those, especially when I was very young. Once I got older in high school, we didn't have to do those. But when I was very young, we had to do those. So clearly, the fallout from an all-out nuclear war would not then, the bad then would not outweigh the good, no matter how good our intentions would be. In fact, one of the things that kept during the Cold War, that kept the U.S. and the Soviet Union from actually going into at times from going into a complete all-out conflict, was the concept of MAD, M-A-D. And that stands for mutually assured destruction. So the fact that the United States had hundreds and thousands of nuclear missiles, the Soviet Union had hundreds and thousands of nuclear missiles, the U.S. was always ahead of the Soviet Union in its missile count, or at least as far as we knew. And so, if an all-out war were to happen between those two superpowers at that time, they could totally annihilate both nations. But not only both nations, they would annihilate large portions, if not all, of the world. And so there was mutually assured destruction. And so as a result of that, they thought there's no good justification then to go to war. There would be no good resulting from that. But that hasn't stopped us from armed conflicts. And certainly that did not stop us from using nuclear weapons during World War II. And one could argue that those ended World War II. But that is one thing to consider. So the good resulting from the war must be proportional to the bad resulting from the war. The sixth point, there must be a reasonable chance of success. That's kind of self-explanatory. You would not go to battle without first counting the cost. Do we have a chance? Because then, otherwise, you're putting the lives of soldiers, men and women, on the front lines for that battle when there is little hope of success or no hope of success. And so that's really an act of futility, and it might be better just to lay down your weapons and surrender at that point rather than face large amounts of bloodshed. So there's a clip that I will post for you, but I want to run through some definitions for you because these very easily could show up on the final exam. So I'm just going to rattle these off, and you can look them up later. But realism, as opposed to warfare. This is the view that moral standards are not applicable to war, and that instead it instead must be judged on how well it serves the state interests. So it's the view that moral standards are not applicable to war, and that it instead must be judged on how well it serves the state's interest. By state, we mean a nation. So in other words, there is no reason to really think about just war theory. So there are no moral standards. You just simply have to think about how it's going to serve the interests of the two countries that are engaged in war. So there you would not seek a morality. That's called realism. Then there's pacifism, the belief essentially that one should never engage in any type of conflict. The Pennsylvania Dutch, the Amish, Mennonites are some of those. I think Jehovah's Witnesses are technically pacifist. What happened during times of conflict when people could be conscripted or, as we called it, drafted into the military, is that pacifists, if they said we don't believe in conflict and will not participate, they were often given necessary civilian duties to do where they would not be serving in actual combat in the danger of killing another person. So they were still given jobs that were essential, perhaps backfilling where soldiers might be pulled onto the front lines. But pacifism would be the idea that that one would not engage in war. One would be a pacifist. We just talked about just war theory, so I laid out those 6 points for just war theory. I can imagine a question, for example, where I lay out 4 points, and one of them is wrong, and I ask you which one, or I lay out 3 points that are wrong and one that is right, and which one applies to just war theory. I don't know. But let me give you another term. Jus ad bellum. JUS space AD space BELLUM. So this is the justice of war is the literal translation of that. That is the reason that a nation would engage in a fight. So jus ad bellum, the justification of war, the reason that one would go to fight, as opposed to the jus in bello. Let me spell it for you. JUS space IN space BELLO. And this is thought of as justice in war. So this is a discussion about what is done in the act of fighting. Because once you have justified going to war, then there are moralities that one has to consider in the actual act of combat, in the actual act of fighting. And so there are certain principles then that have been agreed upon. These are, I think, often referred to nowadays as the Geneva Conventions, Geneva Conventions of War. So the things that kind of guide the actions that one would do during a war. So, for example, if soldiers are captured in battle, that they will be given, for example, first aid if they need it. They will be fed and treated humanely if they're captured, and that they can be prisoners of war. But there ideally will come a time when the combat, the conflict ceases, that they would be exchanged one with the other parties involved in the conflict. So that would be one of the things that we would talk about, the jus in bello, what is right to do in the actual conflict, the justice in war. Other things, for example, civilian targets should not be targeted generally. Now, they might be collateral damage, but for example, hospitals should not be targeted in the act of war. And that's why, for example, medical units will have, and for example, the Red Cross will have huge red crosses on their vehicles, or in the Muslim world, they will have the Red Crescent. So Red Cross and Red Crescent that they will have on their vehicles. They will have. I had a friend. He worked in a military hospital, and he would talk about the dangers that they would face because the base would be just, they would be justified in attacking. That he was in Afghanistan and Iraq. The base one could justify attacking, but the medical units should not be attacked. And he talked about how that at times they, in this bed, he would go to this bed in this bay, hospital bay, and there they would be treating one of the U.S. soldiers that had been injured by, for example, like an IED, an improvised explosive device, and in the very next bed could be one of the enemy combatants, and the hospital would have to treat them both. Because those are the acceptable and agreed upon conventions of war. That if the enemy is in need of aid and they are captured, you will render that aid to them because you would expect that aid would be rendered to your soldiers if they were captured. That might sound a little bit like, who is it? Maybe a categorical imperative of Immanuel Kant. Now, that has not always been the case. And you think, oh, well, the U.S. is always. No. We had some situations, Abu Ghraib, back during the Iraqi War, the second Iraqi War, where we had a number of U.S. soldiers who were abusing prisoners. I would encourage you to look that up or to ask someone about that. In fact, I might try to find some videos of that. So that you can see some of what was going on. So then we also have non-combatant immunity. So those who are not engaged in the actual conflict, they're non-combatants, they should be immune to the effects of the war. So for example, if you live in a war zone, ideally your home should not be attacked or used in any way. Remember, that was one of the reasons why the colonies were revolting against Great Britain, is because the colonists would have to quarter soldiers, and they were against that. Well, this is sort of the same thing in arguing that if you're not engaged in the combat, you should have immunity from the effects of the war. Non-state actors. Non-state actors are those who are not part of a recognized country or nation in any way, and they will engage in combat. The combat that they generally engage in is thought of to be terrorism. So non-state actors we generally refer to as terrorists, because they're not acting with the sanction, the endorsement of a legitimate authority. Remember that was one of the reasons, or one of the points of just war theory, is that it must be sanctioned by a proper authority. Well, if you're acting as a non-state actor and you're engaged in some type of combat, then you don't have legitimate authorization or proper authorization, and so therefore you're usually defined as a terrorist. So there are a couple of definitions for terrorism that I want to offer to you. Number one is terrorism is violence against non-combatants for political, religious, or ideological ends. Let me say it again. So one definition of terrorism is violence against non-combatants, violence against non-combatants for political, religious, or ideological ends. Now, the U.S. State Department defines that a little differently. So the U.S. State Department has a different definition of terrorism. Their definition is premeditated, politically motivated violence perpetuated against non-combatant targets by subnational groups or clandestine agents, usually intended to influence an audience. Let me read that one again because it's a little more complicated, but I prefer the first definition. So terrorism, as defined by the U.S. State Department, is premeditated, politically motivated violence perpetuated against non-combatant targets by subnational groups or clandestine agents, usually intended to influence an audience. So that would be the definition of terrorism according to the state. And so I've already defined non-state actors. Then there is torture. Torture. How do you define torture? Because the U.S., has been accused of torturing prisoners of war in our base at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and also in Afghanistan, again in Abu Ghraib prison. We were accused of torturing. Of course, we know that U.S. combatants, U.S. Military combatants have been tortured at times as well. So what is torture? It is the intentional inflicting of severe pain or suffering on people to punish or intimidate them or extract information from them. So it's intentional inflicting of severe pain or suffering on people to punish, intimidate, or extract information. The thing about extracting information is that they have found that people who are tortured will say anything to get the torture to stop. So they will lie, they will say anything necessary, they will say whatever you want them to say just to alleviate the suffering and the pain. So that's why generally it's understood that torture is not effective and really doesn't help the situation at all. Now finally, One more term that I want to give you is humanitarian intervention. Humanitarian intervention. Humanitarian intervention. And that is the act of a state or states going to war to defend people of another state against the aggression of their own regime. So that is the act of a state or states going to war to defend people of another state against the aggression of their own regime. So, when the U.S. Engaged in World War II along with our allies, we fought Germany. We've actually fought 2 wars against Germany. And that was, for at least in part, for humanitarian intervention. That would be the war in Europe. The war in the Pacific was for a whole nother reason altogether. That's something that's seldom talked about, is that we entered World War II on 2 fronts with 2 different purposes for going to war. So that's just a little bit to think about when we're talking about just war theory and how do we think about war in that sense. As we're, once we get into this, where are my other notes here? There's some other questions that we might want to engage. And so this is where we're going to branch out a little bit, and this won't take quite as long as that did. But we're going to talk about terrorism versus civil disobedience. So terrorism we just defined as generally non-state actors trying to achieve a political end. Let me read it again. Non-state violence against non-combatants for political, religious, or ideological ends. So that's the definition of terrorism that we will work with. But the operative word in that definition is violence against non-combatants. So when we talk about terrorism, how does that then relate to civil disobedience? And by that, I have in mind something like Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement of the 60s. What about Stonewall of the very late 60s, 69 into the 70s? What then do we make about Black Lives Matter movement? What about Antifa? What about Proud Boys? One of my heroes, William Sloane Coffin, who was a huge proponent of civil rights and activities like that. He actually, and some others actually went to prison for some of their activities. But they were nonviolent. So one of the questions we would ask about terrorism is whether or not it's possible to counter an ideology. So if you have a terrorist group, how then do you counter that? Can you actually counter an ideology or people's religious beliefs or their political beliefs? Generally, we would say that no, you can't really change someone's idea, especially with violence, or the people who are violent. You generally cannot change their idea by reacting violently against them. So then, how do you engage with terrorists? The U.S. is trying to do that right now in Afghanistan. How do you effectively engage in conversation with terrorists? So terrorism almost always has one of those three motives: political, religious, or ideological. So then we could ask the question, what about school shootings? Are school shootings, mall shootings, Walmart shootings, how are they different from acts of terrorism? Is there a political, religious, or ideological motive to them? Now, if we think of Dylan Roof, who shot up Mother Emanuel in Charleston, South Carolina, he clearly had a racist motive. That would be political or an ideological motive. But we still don't know, for example, why the largest mass shooting, which was in Las Vegas a couple of years ago, we still don't know why that happened. We have no clue. And he killed more people than any other gunman in a mass shooting ever, at least in modern history. So how then, what do we call things like that? Are they acts of terrorism? If someone is seeking attention or fame, or infamy, as we might say, can we adequately call that terrorism? I don't think we can. What about when a group like the Proud Boys conflict with Black Lives Matter or Antifa? What about when the Klan conflicts? Which side is a terrorist then? It is something to give some thought to. And that's why I think Martin Luther King Jr., who learned his nonviolent methods from Gandhi, that's why I think that movement was so profound, because the training that those civil rights workers went through, hopefully I can find a video of that for you, the training that they went through so that they would not react violently when they were being spat upon and kicked and water hosed and everything else, called all sorts of just derogatory and horrible names. The training that they went through is absolutely excruciating to watch, but they never reacted violently. What turned the tide, or began to turn the tide, for the civil rights movement was the fact that they weren't reacting. And when the rest of America saw images of these young people not reacting violently, when the sanctioned authorities, the police, the sheriffs, were treating them in those ways, with water cannons, with dogs, and they would not react violently. Those images are the very things that turned the minds of Americans all across the country to think more sympathetically to the civil rights movement. So those are just some things to begin to think about as we wrap up this little bit of a chapter. I'll probably post a couple of discussion questions and ask you to think about those. But I did want to get the lecture out to you for now, and to tell you how we're going to be proceeding with the final exam and things like that. All right, guys, I hope you have a good afternoon. From where I'm sitting, it's quite beautiful. I still have some other work to do. Don't forget, I need your papers. If you need more time, you need to get in touch with me. Email me. If you haven't signed up for a class presentation, you need to do that post-haste. Otherwise, I hope you have a good day. and I hope you're probably glad that the semester is about over. All right, have a good day. Bye.